When you think of warfare during the Middle Ages, do you picture an old world that was lawless, primitive, where nothing was ever recorded and everything was complete chaos? If so, the reality was far different from that. Contrary to what Hollywood movies have shown us, the people of the Middle Ages were far more sophisticated and rule-based than we tend to think. Warfare was no different. During that era, wars were supported by a highly sophisticated military financing system. So how was war financing tracked during the Middle Ages? That's exactly what we're exploring today. How wars were financed in the Middle Ages and how their money was managed. But before that, we need to understand where the money came from. How did medieval commanders finance their wars? The truth is, they had several different methods. The most common one was taxation. This isn't particularly surprising. Through what was known as a war tax or an army tax, a certain percentage of taxes was collected from the population, and that revenue was allocated to the army's planned offensive or defensive strategies. In many ways, this system was quite similar to modern-day defense budgets. However, military commanders, much like skilled investors, didn't rely on just a single source of income. Imagine that a war was already taking place in a foreign land. Commanders couldn't constantly return home and ask their governments for additional funding. So, they came up with more creative solutions. One of these was the tribute system. States or territories that were defeated or conquered during the war were required to pay tribute as part of the peace terms. This tribute could come in the form of money or valuable resources, allowing the victorious side to finance its ongoing military operations. Another major source of income was ransom. During the Middle Ages, the ransom market was highly developed. It had its own brokers, regulations, and intermediaries, making it a well-organized institution. Nobles, bishops, and knights captured during war were held for ransom. Their families or allies negotiated the payment, and once the agreed amount had been paid, the prisoner was released. Unlike what Hollywood often portrays, ransom holders did not behave like modern criminal organizations. Prisoners were generally treated quite well. In fact, some soldiers were captured and ransomed several times during the same war. For example, during the 100 Years' War, one English soldier is said to have been captured and ransomed no fewer than 14 times. As the Middle Ages progressed, merchant banks and knightly orders also became important sources of military financing. These institutions either provided cash loans directly or issued payment documents that could be redeemed at another branch. Over time, another financing method emerged. Wealthy individuals were granted certain titles and privileges in exchange for substantial financial contributions. And of course, if all of these methods failed, there was always the oldest solution: looting. Armies plundered the countryside and seized the wealth of cities and religious institutions. In fact, looting was one of the greatest incentives for joining the military. Soldiers' wages were extremely low and often weren't enough to justify risking their lives. As a result, when commanders couldn't pay their troops, they allowed them to collect the spoils of war instead. As you can see, medieval societies developed remarkably creative ways to finance their wars. But how was all of that money actually tracked? One of the most common methods involved tally sticks. These were wooden sticks marked with notches that served as receipts. They were incredibly simple to understand, allowing even illiterate people to keep track of transactions. This system was used throughout every rank of the military. Since wars involved constant negotiations, payments, and exchanges, some commanders eventually adopted a more advanced method: split tally sticks. A single stick was split into two matching pieces, each containing the exact same information. One half remained with the payer, while the other stayed with the recipient, providing proof of the transaction for both parties. A very similar method was also developed in China. The difference was that bamboo was used instead of wood. The system proved so reliable that during the early years of the Bank of England, some stocks were even issued using split tally sticks. For larger and more institutional transactions, much more detailed record-keeping systems were used. One of these was a document known as a chirograph. These documents were written in 2 to 4 copies on the same sheet of parchment. Once an agreement had been finalized, the parchment was cut into separate pieces using irregular cuts known as indentures. As transactions became larger and more complex, it became impractical to fit every copy onto a single sheet. However, the practice of using these irregular cuts continued. One of the best surviving examples dates back to early 15th century England. It confirms a financial agreement between Henry V and several military captains who supplied troops during the Battle of Agincourt. Another fascinating method was a messenger system that closely resembled today's UPS or FedEx services. It may sound strange, but that's exactly how it worked. Whenever a commander needed information regarding financial transactions, specially trained messengers were dispatched. These individuals possessed exceptional knowledge of the terrain and could travel long distances very quickly. Most of them worked independently. However, kings and high-ranking nobles also employed their own private messengers. Their travel expenses and accommodations were covered, and they carried royal decrees granting them special rights and protections. In many ways, they were a combination of a courier and a diplomatic envoy. In the medieval Islamic world, even more fascinating methods were used. Carrier pigeons were employed to transport financial documents and important messages. During the Crusades, a regular pigeon communication service operated between Baghdad and Damascus. The Arab world was also far more advanced in mathematics. Sophisticated mathematical methods were used to conduct financial audits. In fact, the foundations of modern algebra can largely be traced back to these practices. Outside Eurasia, in pre-Columbian South America, another unique recording system was used, known as the quipu. This system relied on colored strings with knots, where each knot represented a numerical value. In essence, it was based on the same underlying principle as tally sticks. When we look back at it, many of the creative methods developed during the Middle Ages to track military finances eventually became the foundation of modern accounting systems. Medieval history is truly fascinating. Many of the ideas and methods developed during that era helped shape the technologies and financial systems we rely on today. If you enjoy these kinds of in-depth explorations of history, be sure to check out our other video about the history of money. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.